The great hall of Chateau Valmire fell silent the moment she walked through its doors. Not because she was beautiful, though she was. Not because she was noble, though her bloodline stretched back 4 generations to the lords of Aquitaine. The hall fell silent because of what followed her. 6 armed men in the livery of the Count of Valmire, hands resting on sword hilts, eyes forward, escorting her as though she were a prisoner. Because she was. Lady Elspeth de Moran walked without trembling. That alone was remarkable. She was 23 years of age, a widow of 8 months, and the charges being brought against her this morning, adultery, conspiracy against the House of Valmire, and the poisoning of her late husband, carried a single punishment under the laws of that land and that era: death. She did not look at the assembled lords who lined the hall. She did not look at the Count himself, seated upon his carved oak chair like a man who had already decided the verdict and was merely observing the formality of a trial. She looked only at one man who stood apart from the others near the far pillar, his arms crossed, his face carved from stone. Sir Aldrich of Thornwall. He had been her husband's most trusted knight. He had sworn, on his knees before God and the assembled household, to protect her. He had spoken that vow with his right hand pressed flat against the gospel, his voice steady and his eyes clear. That was 14 months ago. Now he stood in the hall that was about to condemn her, and he did not move. He did not speak. He barely breathed. What no one in that hall could see, what no tapestry would ever record, what no chronicle would ever dare name, was the war being fought inside that man at that very moment. A war without swords, a war without armies. A war fought entirely within the span of one chest between one heartbeat and the next. He had sworn to protect her. He had not counted on what protecting her would cost. He had not counted on what protecting her from would mean. The Count raised one hand and the room stirred back to life. Clerks shuffled parchment. Guards straightened. A priest muttered something that may have been a prayer or may have been nothing at all. "Lady Elspeth de Moran," the Count said, his voice carrying the particular coldness of a man who mistakes cruelty for justice. "You stand before this court accused. How do you answer?" She lifted her chin. Just slightly. Just enough. And in that small, defiant gesture, in the fraction of an inch by which she raised her face against a world that had already decided her fate, something inside Sir Aldrich of Thornwall finally, irrevocably, broke. But to understand how we arrived at this moment, to understand why a knight sworn to honor stood silent while the woman in his charge was led to her destruction, we must go back. We must go back to the autumn of 1186, to a keep on the edge of the Dordogne, where a dying lord made a choice that would set all of this in motion, to the day Sir Aldrich first arrived at Valmire, road-worn and purposeful, carrying nothing but his sword, his name, and a code of conduct he believed, with every sinew of his being, was enough. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. The year was 1186, and the land of Aquitaine was caught between 2 kinds of war, the kind fought with steel and the kind fought with silence. The great crusading fever had not yet broken. Thousands of men had already marched east and not returned, swallowed by deserts and sieges and the particular madness that seizes men when they convince themselves that God requires their deaths to prove a point. Those who remained in the West governed in their absence or tried to. The lords of southern France, caught between the ambitions of the English crown to the north and the old Occitan traditions beneath their feet, were men permanently balancing on the edge of allegiance. Loyalty was not a fixed star in that world. It was a commodity. It was traded, inherited, stolen, and sometimes simply evaporated, like morning dew on a stone wall, leaving no trace that it had ever existed. Into this world, Chateau Valmire sat like a closed fist. It was not the largest stronghold in the region. It was not the wealthiest. But it possessed something more valuable than either size or gold in the politics of 12th century France. It sat at the crossing of 2 roads that connected the markets of the south to the pilgrimage routes of the north. Whoever controlled Valmire controlled movement. And in a world where information traveled no faster than a horse, controlling movement was controlling power. The Lord of Valmere, Raymond de Maran, understood this with the cold precision of a man who had inherited intelligence but not wisdom. He was 51 years old, broad through the shoulders, narrowing rapidly through the eyes. He had fought in his youth. There were scars on his left forearm and a slight drag in his right leg from a lance wound sustained at a tournament he preferred not to discuss. But he had learned over decades that battles fought in great halls were more decisive than battles fought in open fields. He was not cruel in the way that men who enjoy cruelty are cruel. He was cruel in the way that men who value efficiency are cruel, quickly, without lingering, and always with justification prepared in advance. Raymond had one son, Gilles, legitimate, acknowledged, trained to inherit, and one problem. Gilles de Maran was 24 years old, reasonably competent with a sword, and possessed of a character that could most charitably be described as impressionable. He was the kind of young man who reflected the qualities of whoever stood nearest to him, which meant that in good company he appeared principled, and in bad company he appeared to have no principles whatsoever. This was not evil. It was something almost worse. It was weakness dressed in the clothing of decency, which is always more dangerous because it takes longer to recognize. Raymond's second problem was his brother, Count Aldus de Valmere. The title was a matter of some dispute, inherited through a maternal line that Raymond had always considered legally dubious and personally insulting. Governed the neighboring estate from a stone house that was insufficiently grand for his ambitions and excessively expensive for his means. Aldus was 46, lean where Raymond was broad, talkative where Raymond was silent, and possessed of the particular bitterness that attaches itself to men who believe they deserve more than they have received. He had allies at court. He had debts that exceeded those allies' patience, and he had, for the better part of a decade, been watching Valmere's road revenues with the focused attention of a man calculating exactly how much it would cost him to take what he believed should already be his. The woman at the center of all of this, the woman who would, in the end, prove to be more consequential than any of the men who believed they controlled her, was Elspeth. She had come to Valmere at 17 as Gilles de Maran's intended bride, arranged by her father, Lord Henri de Caussade, in a compact that was equal parts political prudence and financial necessity. The de Caussade name carried prestige and a crumbling castle. The de Maran name carried coin and a working one. The marriage was, by the standards of the age, a reasonable transaction. No one had asked Elspeth. She was not, however, what anyone had expected. The lords and ladies of Valmere had anticipated a modest girl, deferential and decorative, who would manage the household linen and produce heirs, and otherwise remain invisible in the way that well-bred women were expected to remain invisible. What arrived instead was a young woman with gray eyes that registered everything and revealed nothing, who read Latin well enough to correct the household chaplain's citations, who listened at council meetings with an attention so complete and so still that men forgot she was present and said things they would later regret, and who possessed the rarest of political gifts, the ability to make powerful people feel that she posed no threat whatsoever, while never actually being powerless. She married Gilles in the spring of 1183. The wedding was attended by 200 guests. The marriage itself, in the truest sense of a shared life, never quite arrived. Gilles was not unkind to her. He was simply absent. Absent in spirit when present in body, and frequently absent in body as well. Drawn away by hunting parties and drinking companions and the particular restlessness of young men who have been given everything and find that everything is somehow insufficient. Elspeth managed the household. She cultivated the steward's respect. She learned which servants could be trusted and which could not. She memorized the names of every tenant farmer on the Valmire lands, their debts, their harvests, their feuds with neighboring farms. She did all of this quietly, systematically, without drawing attention, because she understood, with a clarity that was remarkable in a woman of 20, that attention in her situation was a form of danger. Then, in the autumn of 1185, two things happened in close succession. Raymond de Maran, Lord of Valmere, suffered the first of what would prove to be several strokes. A sudden seizing of the right side of his body during morning prayers that left him bedridden for 6 weeks, and diminished in ways he refused to acknowledge for the rest of his life. The stronghold that had run on his iron will suddenly required other hands to hold it together. Julius, who was not prepared for this, began to make small errors that compounded into larger ones. The steward grew uncertain, the knights grew restless, and Count Aldous de Valmere, watching from across the valley, smiled for the first time in years. The second thing that happened was the arrival of Sir Aldrich of Thornwall. He came without fanfare, which was characteristic of him. He was 32 years old, a knight of the second tier, meaning he had earned his spurs through service rather than birth, which in the hierarchy of that world placed him above common soldiers and below lords by a margin that was real in practical terms and absolute in social ones. He was tall, dark-haired, with the kind of face that is not handsome in repose but becomes something close to it in motion, animated by an intelligence that had no other outlet than observation. He had served for 4 years in the household of the Bishop of Périgueux, a posting that had taught him, among other things, that institutions built on principle are frequently operated by men who possess very little of it. He had come to Valmere because Raymond de Maron, in a rare moment of clarity following his illness, had sent for a knight he could trust. Not a knight of great family, not a knight whose loyalty was conditional on inheritance or alliance, a knight who had a reputation, modest but solid, for honoring his word when honoring it cost something. Raymond's instructions to Aldrich were precise and, at their core, human. He was dying, though he would not say it aloud. His son was not ready. His brother was circling. And his daughter-in-law, the young woman who had, in 2 years of quiet competence, become the most reliable mind in the household, was standing in a position of extraordinary vulnerability, because she had no blood claim to Valmere, no powerful father able to protect her from a distance, and the kind of influence that, in a world governed by men who feared what they could not control, made her a target. Raymond had asked Aldrich to come. He had asked him to serve. He had asked him on a cold October morning in the great hall with the fire burning low, and the old man's hand shaking slightly on the arms of his chair, to swear a knight's oath of protection over Elspeth de Moran. Aldrich had knelt. He had placed his hand on the gospel. He had spoken the words. He had meant every one of them, in the way that a man means a vow when he makes it standing at the threshold of a story whose ending he cannot yet see. The first months passed without incident, which in the world of Chateau Valmere meant that the war was simply being fought in rooms Aldrich had not yet learned to watch. He was methodical by nature. In those early weeks, he walked the estate with the deliberate attention of a man reading a text he knows to be important, but has not yet fully understood. Studying the geography of the outbuildings, the rhythms of the guards' rotations, the way the servants moved through the corridors at different hours of the day. He spoke little and listened at length. He learned quickly that the steward, a broad Gascon named Barrade, was loyal to the estate itself rather than to any particular person within it. A useful kind of loyalty, steady as stone, but without heat. He learned that the captain of the guard, a scarred veteran called Perrin, harbored a quiet contempt for Gilles, that he concealed with the practiced ease of a man who had been concealing contempt for most of his adult life. He learned that Count Aldous visited Valmere precisely once a month, always announced, always cordial, always accompanied by a different configuration of men whose presence suggested purpose that the visits themselves never openly declared. He learned more slowly and with more resistance than he would have liked that he was watching Elspeth. He told himself in the beginning that this was the nature of the oath. He had sworn to protect her. Watching her was protection. Noting who approached her, who sought private conversation, who left her presence looking thoughtful or unsettled. This was vigilance, not fascination. He was a professional. He had served a bishop for 4 years without once confusing his duties with his inclinations. But Elspeth was not a bishop. She moved through the household like someone who had long since accepted that the world was not built for her, and had quietly decided to navigate it anyway. Not with resignation, which implies defeat, but with a kind of precise, undefeated practicality that Aldrich found, against his will, extraordinary. She remembered everything. She wasted nothing. Not words, not time, not the goodwill of people who could not directly benefit her. She was kind to servants in the specific way that reveals character rather than performing it, remembering names and ailments and the names of children, without any audience to approve of her doing so. She was also, by the late winter of that first year, aware of everything that Aldrich had been trying to learn, and had been aware of it considerably longer than he had. The moment he understood this came in February, on a gray morning when he found her in the small scriptorium off the chapel, reading correspondence that he recognized, with a start he managed to conceal, as the steward's accounts for the past quarter. She looked up when he entered. She did not look guilty. She looked like a woman who had been waiting for someone to notice. "You've been asking Barad about the road tolls," she said without preamble. "I have. He'll tell you they've been steady." She set down the parchment. "They haven't? There is a pattern of undercounting on the northern road that began 8 months ago. Someone is reporting lower cart traffic than the guard's logs support. The difference annualized amounts to roughly 40 livres." Aldrich was quiet for a moment. "Who knows this?" "You do now," she said. "I've known since October. I haven't told Gilles because he would confront whoever is responsible before we knew how far the arrangement extended, and I haven't told Raymond because the news would distress him, and he is not well enough to act on it usefully." She paused, and in that pause was the entire weight of a woman who had spent years making decisions no one had authorized her to make because no one capable of making them was available. "I've been waiting for someone Raymond trusted enough to send." That was the morning Aldrich understood that he was not protecting Elspeth de Moran from the outside world. He was protecting her from a household that had not yet decided whether to acknowledge what she actually was. The toll fraud, when they traced it carefully over the following weeks, led not to Count Aldous, which was what Aldrich had initially suspected, but to one of Gilles's companions, a young knight named Foucard who had been skimming the difference and splitting it with the Northern Road's senior guard. It was not a grand conspiracy. It was the ordinary corruption of bored men with access and insufficient supervision. But the way it was handled revealed everything about the fault lines of Valmir. Aldrich brought the evidence to Gilles directly, which was correct procedure. Gilles sat with it for 3 days. 3 days during which Foucard, who was not unintelligent, clearly became aware that something had shifted, and then summoned the young knight and, instead of dismissing him or bringing formal charges, accepted a private restitution and allowed Foucard to remain in the household. Demoted in title, but otherwise intact. Aldrich said nothing. He had no standing to override the Lord's decision. But that evening he walked the eastern wall of the chateau for a long time, watching the valley go dark, and he thought about Raymond's shaking hands and the particular kind of fear that attaches to a dying man who can see with perfect clarity the unraveling that will begin the moment he is no longer present to prevent it. It was Foucard who moved first against Elspeth. Whether this was on Count Aldus's instruction or on his own initiative, Aldrich was never entirely certain. But in the spring of 1186, a rumor began to circulate, carefully, in the way that rumors circulate when they are being managed rather than merely gossiped, that Lady Elspeth had been seen meeting privately with a merchant from Cahors, who was known to have connections to the Count's household. The meetings were real. Aldrich knew this because he had been present at 2 of them, at Elspeth's direct invitation as a witness. The merchant was a supplier of winter grain who had been underpaying his road fees and had come to renegotiate his arrangement. The meetings were entirely commercial and entirely legitimate. The rumor, however, did not describe them that way. In the version that reached the hall, and eventually reached Gilles via Foucard over wine, the meetings were private. The merchant was young. The lady had been seen laughing. A woman laughing in a room with a man who was not her husband in 12th century France was a sentence that finished itself. Aldrich addressed it immediately, directly, and with the controlled fury of a man who has learned to keep his voice level when his instincts are anything but. He found Foucard in the training yard and stated in the presence of 3 other knights that the account being circulated was false, that he had been present at the meetings in question, and that any man who continued to repeat it would be answering to him personally. Foucard smiled. It was the smile of a man who has already accomplished his purpose. "Of course, Sir Aldrich," he said pleasantly. No one is suggesting anything improper. But the seed had been planted. Seeds of that particular variety do not require tending. They grow in the dark, on the heat of suggestion alone. Raymond de Maran died in June. He died on a Thursday morning, in his bed, with the chaplain beside him, and the windows open to let in the sound of the river below the southern wall. He had been declining for months, and the end, when it came, was quiet. The kind of death that seems, from the outside, like a mercy, and feels from the inside, like a door closing on everything that had been keeping the cold out. Gilles inherited formally within the week, which was law, and became Lord of Valmere, which was title, without becoming the thing that both required, a man capable of holding what he had been given. Count Aldous attended the funeral. He embraced his nephew with visible warmth. He wept at the graveside with what appeared to be genuine grief. He stayed for 5 days, which was 3 days longer than etiquette required. And in those 5 days he spoke privately with Gilles on 4 separate occasions, in rooms that Aldrich was not invited to enter. When Aldous departed, something had shifted. It was not immediately visible. It rarely is, in the way that the shift of a foundation stone is not immediately visible in the walls above it. But Aldrich could feel it, in the way that men who have spent years in dangerous households develop a sensitivity to the texture of the air in rooms where decisions have been made without them. Gilles began to drink more heavily. This was not new, but the quality of it changed. It became purposeful rather than sociable, the drinking of a man who is drowning something specific rather than celebrating in a general way. He became short with the steward. He began to cancel the morning councils that Raymond had kept faithfully for 30 years, the small administrative hearings where tenants could bring their grievances and the household could take the pulse of the estate. And he began to watch his wife with an expression that Aldrich recognized with cold certainty, as the expression of a man who has been told something about her that he cannot unknow and cannot bring himself to verify. Aldrich went to Elspeth directly. They met in the scriptorium. It had become, by unspoken agreement, the room where they spoke honestly, away from the ears of the hall. She was standing at the narrow window when he arrived, looking out at the courtyard below with the particular stillness that, he had learned, meant she was already several steps ahead of the conversation they were about to have. "You know," he said, "I know that Aldous has been in Gilles' ear." She turned from the window. "I know that whatever was said concerned me. I know that Gilles has not looked at me directly in 11 days. Her voice was even. Her hands were completely still at her sides. "I don't know the specific shape of the accusation yet, but I know its purpose. If Gilles can be made to doubt me, everything I've built in this household becomes leverage against me instead of protection. I'll go to Gilles." "And say what?" Aldrich opened his mouth and closed it again, because she was right, and they both knew it. A knight declaring his sworn lady innocent of an as-yet unspoken charge, before the charge had been publicly made, would look like nothing so much as a knight with a reason to protect her. And a knight with a reason to protect her was, in the grammar of that world, a knight with a reason. "There must be something," he began. "There is." She looked at him with those gray eyes that registered everything. "But you won't like it." What she proposed was this: that Aldrich go to Count Aldous directly. Not with a threat, she was precise about this, but with information. She had been tracking the toll fraud that they had discovered in the winter. Foucard had been removed from his position on the northern road, but the undercounting had not entirely stopped, which suggested that the arrangement had been more deeply embedded than a single corrupt guard. She had a name that connected the arrangement not to Foucard, who was a small man running a small scheme, but to a merchant in Aldous's network who had been the financial beneficiary of the diverted revenue. Aldous, in other words, had been profiting from the theft from his nephew's estate. "You want to use this against him," Aldrich said. "I want to show him that I have it," she said carefully. "There is a difference." He looked at her for a long time. "That's not protection," he said. "That's politics." "Yes," she agreed. "Welcome to how women survive." He went to Aldous. He requested a private audience, which was granted with the smooth, immediate courtesy of a man who has been expecting exactly this conversation. They met in the Count's receiving room on a Tuesday morning, with the autumn light coming in flat and pale through the high windows, and Aldrich laid out what he knew with the precision and economy of a man who has rehearsed a difficult speech until all the emotion has been burned out of it, leaving only the structure. Aldous listened without interrupting. When Aldrich finished, the Count was quiet for a moment, the theatrical quiet of a man performing consideration. "That is a serious accusation," Aldous said at last. "It is a serious matter." Another pause. Then, "And you come to me with this, rather than to my nephew? Because the solution I am proposing doesn't require your nephew's involvement." Aldous looked at him with the specific expression of a man recalibrating. "You're asking me to leave Elspeth de Moran alone?" "I'm informing you," Aldrich said, "that whatever arrangement you believe serves your interest better with her discredited, it does not serve them better than the alternative." The Count nodded slowly. He looked for a moment almost amused. "Raymond chose well when he sent for you," he said. It was not a compliment. It was the observation of a man filing something away for later use. Aldrich left the meeting believing he had won. This was his first serious error in judgment. He had understood Aldous' intelligence correctly and his ambition correctly and his methods correctly. What he had failed to account for was the one factor that no strategic calculation can reliably incorporate: wounded pride. Aldous de Valmere was a man who had spent his entire life watching what he considered his birthright administered by his elder brother, and now by his brother's weak son. He could be deterred. He could not be humiliated. These are not the same thing, and Aldrich had, in his precision and his economy and his controlled fury, accomplished both. He would not realize this until it was already too late. What happened next moved quickly, in the way that disasters always move quickly once a certain point has been passed. Not because events accelerate, but because all the slow preparation that preceded them is finally visible, and what looked like isolated incidents snaps into pattern all at once. Gilles de Moran fell ill in October. It began as a fever, unremarkable in a season of fevers, and progressed over 3 weeks into something more serious. The household physicians were summoned. Remedies were prepared. The chaplain prayed at increasing length. And Gilles, who had never been a strong man in body or in spirit, declined with a speed that alarmed everyone who understood what his death would mean for the balance of power at Valmere. He was dead before November ended. The official account was fever. The unofficial account, circulating within 48 hours in the precise, managed way that Aldrich had learned to recognize as the signature of someone who wanted a story to travel, was something else entirely. The unofficial account named Elspeth. It named her with the specificity that rumors require to be believed: a particular herb, a particular cup, a particular evening when she had been alone with him. It named her with the false precision of a lie that has been constructed by someone who knows that true things are usually approximate and invented things are usually exact. And it arrived in the great hall of Valmire at the same moment, not the next day, not the following week, but the same morning, that Count Aldous rode through the gates unannounced with 20 armed men at his back, to offer his services in the governance of the estate during this time of tragedy and uncertainty. Elspeth was arrested before the evening meal. Aldrich was standing in the courtyard when they brought her out. He was standing there because he had heard what was happening and had moved toward it, and then had stopped, had physically stopped 10 feet from the door, because he had looked at the 20 men in Aldous' livery, and the 8 men of the Valmere Guard who were already, visibly, no longer certain whose orders they were following, and he had performed, in the space of 3 seconds, a calculation that he had never in his life expected to be required to make. He could intervene. He had his sword. He had his oath. He had in the abstract every right and every reason. But Elspeth was one woman, and Aldous had 20 armed men, and a knight who drew his blade in a courtyard full of soldiers and survived the next 30 seconds was still a knight who had committed violence against the household of a count, which meant he was an outlaw, which meant he was dead, which meant Elspeth had no one. He did not draw his sword. She walked past him as they led her away. She did not look at him with accusation. She looked at him with something worse, with the precise, clear, unsentimental understanding of a woman who has already calculated everything he had just calculated and arrived at the same answer, and who knows with absolute certainty that being right does not make it bearable. He stood in the courtyard until long after the door had closed behind her. The evening came down over the valley. A bell rang somewhere in the chapel. His oath had been to protect her. The man she needed protecting from was himself. From the knowledge that protecting her might require him to become something the oath had never anticipated. The morning after Elspeth's arrest, Aldrich did not sleep. He sat through the night in his small chamber off the eastern corridor, on the edge of his bed, with his sword across his knees in the way that soldiers sit when they are not expecting a fight, but need the weight of the thing to think clearly. He had spent 4 years in the service of a bishop who had taught him, among other things, that every impossible situation contains within it a door, small, badly lit, requiring you to bend to pass through it, and that the work of a man in crisis is not to find a comfortable solution, but to find the door. He found it before dawn. He did not like it. At first light he went to Barreau the steward. Barreau was a practical man, which in this context meant he was a frightened one. Not of violence, which he had seen enough of to have made his peace with, but of uncertainty, which to a man who had managed an estate for 20 years was a far more intimate terror. He was in the great hall when Aldrich found him, standing at the long table with a set of accounts spread before him, and the expression of a man trying to calculate how much of what he knew could be safely forgotten. "I need the correspondence," Aldrich said without sitting. "Everything that passed between Raymond and Aldous in the last year of Raymond's life. And anything you have, anything at all, documenting the road toll accounts from August forward." Barad looked at him for a long moment. "That correspondence is the Lord's property. The Lord is dead. The estate is in dispute, and the woman currently being held in the South Tower did not poison her husband." Aldrich kept his voice level. "You know this, Barad. You've known it since the rumor started. The question is whether knowing it is enough for you, or whether you need it to matter." It was, he would reflect later, the right thing to say to exactly this man. Barad was not a brave person. He was, however, a person for whom the difference between what was true and what was being said mattered in a way that he could not entirely suppress, even when suppressing it would have been safer. He stood at the table for a moment longer. Then he went to the locked chest at the far end of the hall and began to sort through what was inside it. What Aldrich found in that correspondence was not a confession. He had not expected one. What he found was a pattern, the patient, incremental pattern of a man who had been preparing the ground for years. Letters from Aldous to Raymond, warm in tone and precise in content, asking questions about the road revenues that were framed as fraternal interest, but were, read in sequence, a sustained attempt to map the estate's income with the accuracy of someone who intended to inherit it. Letters from Raymond to Aldous that were, increasingly over the final months, shorter, briefer, more guarded, the letters of a man who is conserving energy and choosing his words with the care of someone who suspects they are being stored. And one letter, undated in a hand that Aldrich did not immediately recognize, that had been folded inside a routine administrative report as though it had been placed there deliberately and then not retrieved. It was brief. It referenced a conversation. It used the phrase, "when the boy is gone," in reference to Gilles, and the phrase, "the matter of the woman," in reference to Elspeth, and it was signed with an initial, A, that was either Aldous or no one, and either damning or meaningless depending entirely on what a court was willing to believe. Aldrich stared at that letter for a long time. Then he did the second thing he had decided to do before dawn. He went to find Perrin. The captain of the guard was in the training yard, running 2 young soldiers through sword drills with the mechanical patience of a man whose mind is somewhere else entirely. He dismissed them when he saw Aldrich's expression. They were alone in the yard, the morning cold and the frost still on the ground between the flagstones. "Tell me about the night Gilles died," Aldrich said. Perrin was quiet for a moment. His face did not change, which was itself a kind of answer. "I've told the Count's men." "Tell me." Another silence. Then, with the slow, reluctant precision of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has finally identified the person he is willing to hand it to. There were 2 men in the corridor outside the Lord's chamber that night who were not Valmir men. I didn't recognize their livery. I assumed they were part of the Count's household. He'd been visiting more frequently in those weeks. I didn't question it. He paused. I should have questioned it. Did you see them enter the chamber? I saw them in the corridor, an hour before the Lord's condition worsened. Perrin looked at him steadily. I have thought about this every day since. Aldrich nodded. I need you to say that. Not to me. To the Bishop of Périgueux. The Bishop of Périgueux was the nearest ecclesiastical authority with sufficient standing to compel a formal inquiry into a noble death, and more importantly, to do so in a way that superseded Count Aldis's claim to administer the estate during the period of uncertainty. It was a narrow legal avenue, imperfectly applicable, likely to be contested. It was also, as far as Aldrich could determine in the space of one sleepless night, the only avenue that did not require him to draw his sword in a courtyard and die for it. He had served the bishop for 4 years. He knew the man, knew his vanity, his genuine piety, his profound discomfort with situations that placed spiritual authority in direct conflict with temporal power, and his equally profound awareness that his relevance depended on being seen to exercise the former when the latter overreached. A murdered noble, a wrongly accused widow, a count moving with suspicious speed to consolidate control of a strategically valuable estate. These were not to the Bishop of Périgueux abstractions. They were an opportunity to be exactly what a bishop was supposed to be. Aldrich wrote the letter that morning. He wrote it with the careful, specific language of a man who has learned that vagueness is the enemy of action, laying out what he knew, what Beraud could document, what Perrin had witnessed, and what the undated letter suggested. He did not overstate. He did not editorialize. He presented the architecture of what had happened and trusted the bishop to understand what it meant. He gave the letter to a writer he trusted, a young man from the village below the chateau whose family had been Valmir tenants for 3 generations, and who had, on 2 separate occasions, demonstrated the particular form of loyalty that comes not from obligation but from genuine conviction. He sent him south before the 2nd bell of the morning. Then he went to Elspeth. She was being held in a room in the south tower that was not a cell in the strictest sense. The door was locked from the outside, and there were 2 men in the corridor, but there was a window and a fire, and the basic dignities of a prisoner whose status was still being negotiated. Aldrich spoke to the men in the corridor. One of them was a Valmir man, old enough to remember Raymond, uncertain enough about the current situation to be open to an argument framed in terms of proper procedure. The other was one of Aldis's men and was not. They reached, through a conversation that lasted approximately 4 minutes and was conducted entirely in the language of authority rather than the language of request, an arrangement. Aldrich could speak with the prisoner briefly with the door open and a guard present. He sat across from her at the small table by the window. The guard stood in the doorway. Outside, the valley was clear and cold, the kind of November morning that looks, at a distance, almost peaceful. I've sent to the bishop, he said quietly. She absorbed this. How long? 4 days to reach him, 2 days for him to decide, 4 days to return with authority. He paused. 10 days, perhaps 12. The hearing Aldis has convened is in 6. He knew this. Yes. She looked at him with those gray eyes that did not waver and did not perform. You are telling me, she said carefully, that you have taken an action that will almost certainly arrive too late to prevent the hearing, but may arrive in time to prevent the outcome being final. Yes. And in the interim? In the interim, he said, I intend to be present at that hearing. For the first time in their conversation, for the first time he realized in all the months he had known her, something moved across her face that was not calculation or composure or the controlled intelligence she wore like armor. It was something rawer and briefer than any of those things. It was there and then gone, smoothed back into steadiness with the practiced discipline of a woman who had learned very young that showing what you felt was a form of exposure she could not afford. Aldrich, she said. It was the first time she had used his given name without the title. The guard in the doorway did not react. Perhaps he had not noticed. If you speak in my defense at that hearing, Aldous will move against you directly afterward. He cannot allow a sworn knight to publicly contradict the basis of the accusation and walk away from it without consequence. He will find a reason. He will find several. I know. You would be forfeiting your position. Possibly your standing, possibly more than that. I know. She was quiet for a moment. You swore an oath to protect me. Yes, this goes beyond the oath. He looked at her directly, in the way he had been carefully not looking at her for 11 months, since the morning in the scriptorium when he had first understood that what he was feeling was not professional vigilance, and never had been. Yes, he said again. It does. The guard shifted in the doorway. Their time was ending. She did not say thank you. He would not have known what to do with gratitude from her. It would have made what he was doing smaller somehow, reduced it to a transaction. Instead, she looked at him with the full weight of what she was. Intelligent, precise, undefeated, frightened in ways she would not show, and said simply, "Don't be reckless. Whatever you do in that hall, do it with your mind, not your heart. My life depends on your clarity, not your courage." He stood. He was almost at the door when she spoke again, so quietly that the guard may not have heard. "I knew," she said, "since spring. I knew what this was, what was happening between us. And I chose not to name it because naming it would have made everything harder for both of us. I want you to know that the not naming was not indifference." He did not turn around. If he had turned around, with the guard in the doorway and the hearing 6 days away and everything still in motion, he would have done something that could not be undone, and that would cost her what he was trying to save. He walked out of the tower and into the cold morning air and stood for a moment with his eyes closed and his hands very still at his sides. He had 6 days. He intended to use every hour of them. What he could not know, what no calculation, however precise, could have prepared him for, was that Aldous had also been thinking carefully about the next 6 days, and had arrived at a conclusion that was simpler, more elegant, and more devastating than anything Aldrich had anticipated. He was not going to wait for the hearing. He was going to offer Elspeth de Moran a choice. The offer came on the 3rd day. It was delivered not by Aldous himself. That would have been too direct, too visible, too easy to characterize afterward as coercion, but by the household chaplain, a thin-fingered man named Father Gilles, who had served Valmere for 12 years, and who had, in that time, developed the particular moral flexibility of a clergyman who has learned that the powerful control not only the land beneath his feet, but the living that keeps him fed. He arrived at Elspeth's door in the South Tower on a gray Wednesday morning, carrying a small wooden cross and the expression of a man who has been asked to do something he knows is wrong, and has decided that knowing it is wrong is sufficient penance for doing it anyway. The offer, as Father Gilles conveyed it with his eyes on the floor, was this. Elspeth de Moran would sign a document confessing to the mismanagement of the Valmere estate during the final months of her father-in-law's illness and the entirety of her husband's brief lordship. Not murder, not poisoning. The formal charges would be quietly reduced to incompetence and financial irregularity, charges that carried no capital penalty, only the forfeiture of her dower rights and her removal from Valmere. She would be permitted to return to her father's house at Caussade. She would be alive. She would be free, in the limited way that a woman stripped of property and position and reputation could be said to be free. In exchange, the hearing would be suspended. The formal accusation of poisoning would not be entered into the record. Her life would not be at risk. Father Gilles delivered all of this to the middle distance somewhere between Elspeth's left shoulder and the wall behind her. When he finished, he waited. "And Sir Aldrich," she said. The chaplain blinked. "My lady? What happens to Sir Aldrich of Thornwall if I sign?" Father Gilles was quiet for a moment that lasted slightly too long. The Count feels that Sir Aldrich has perhaps misunderstood the scope of his commission here at Valmere. His oath of protection was sworn to a lord who is no longer living. The Count believes a formal reassignment. He will be removed from Valmere. He will be reassigned, my lady. His record of service is not in question. The Count has indicated that a posting could be arranged. Where? Another pause. The Eastern Marches. There is a garrison at the Eastern Marches, Elspeth said with a flatness that was not a question. The Eastern Marches in 1186 was not a posting. It was a sentence. The garrison territories on the far edge of the Aquitaine borderlands were undermanned, undersupplied, and under near constant pressure from the shifting loyalties of the lords further east. Men sent there were not expected to build careers. They were expected to occupy space until that space became dangerous, at which point they were expected to occupy it anyway. It was the kind of assignment given to men whose inconvenient survival needed to be arranged into something more convenient. Elspeth looked at the chaplain for a long moment. "Tell the Count," she said carefully, "that I will need until tomorrow morning to consider." Father Gilles nodded, relieved to be almost finished with this errand, and retreated from the room with the slightly too rapid movement of a man who does not want to be asked any further questions. Elspeth sat alone in the tower room for a long time after he left. She was not in those hours thinking about herself, or not only about herself. She was thinking about the architecture of what Aldous had constructed, because understanding its architecture was the only way to find its weakness, and finding its weakness was the only thing that mattered. The offer was elegant in its simplicity: sign and survive, and watch from a distance as Aldous consolidated everything he had been building toward for a decade. Refuse, and face a capital hearing in 3 days before a court that Aldous had packed, on charges that would be difficult to disprove in the time available, with a knight riding toward a garrison on the Eastern Marches who would not be present to speak in her defense. The offer was not mercy, it was mechanics. It removed the two obstacles: her legal claim to Valmir's assets and Aldrich's physical presence as a witness and advocate, without the messiness of a public execution that might attract exactly the kind of ecclesiastical scrutiny that a letter to the Bishop of Périgueux was designed to produce. Aldous knew about the letter. She was certain of this. She had been certain of it since the offer arrived because the timing was too precise to be coincidence. 3 days after Aldrich sent the rider south, the offer appeared, which meant someone in the household had talked, or the rider had been watched, or both, which meant the bishop's response, if it came, might arrive to find the matter already resolved by signature and forfeiture, a done thing, a closed account that ecclesiastical inquiry had no legal basis to reopen. She sat with all of this through the afternoon and into the evening, when the fire burned low and the guard outside her door changed shifts and the valley below went dark. She was still sitting with it when she heard, sometime in the deep middle of the night, a sound that was not quite a knock, too quiet for that, too deliberate, at the base of her door. She crossed the room and looked at the floor. There was a piece of parchment, small, folded once, that had been slid beneath the door with the care of someone who had waited until the corridor was quiet. She unfolded it. There was no salutation. There were 11 words written in a hand she recognized. "Do not sign anything." The rider returned. He brought company. She read it 3 times. Then she held it in the fire until it was ash. She did not sleep. The morning of the hearing arrived with the particular cold clarity of a November day that has decided to be honest about what it is. The great hall of Chateau Valmire had been arranged with the deliberate formality of a space that wants to be understood as a court. The Count's chair elevated on the dais, 2 clerks at a side table, 4 men-at-arms flanking the entrance, the assembled household along the walls in the specific configuration that signals observation rather than participation. The household had been told to attend. Attendance was not optional. Elspeth walked in without signing. She had sent her answer to Father Gilles at dawn, verbal, not written, untraceable, and the chaplain had taken it to the Count, and the Count had, according to the guard who had been standing near enough to hear, said nothing at all for a full 30 seconds before issuing the order to proceed with the hearing. His silence was the silence of a man who has been surprised, and who is filing that surprise away into a category labeled to be addressed at the appropriate time. The hall was full. Every member of the Valmire household who was not actively required elsewhere was present, along with 6 of Aldous' men in full livery and 2 local lords of middling rank who had arrived the previous evening, guests of the Count, whose presence served the dual purpose of witnesses and audience. A proceeding observed by neighboring nobility was a proceeding that could not easily be undone, or so Aldous believed. He had constructed this as a public legitimization of everything he had been building. He had not yet seen what was standing at the back of the hall. Aldrich had positioned himself there deliberately, not at the front, not in a posture of confrontation, but present, visible, unmistakably and deliberately present, in the posture of a man who has every right to be exactly where he is, and is prepared to explain that right at considerable length to anyone who wishes to dispute it. Beside him stood two men Aldous had not invited. The first was a clerk in the livery of the Bishop of Périgueux, a young man unremarkable in appearance, who carried a satchel that contained, among other things, a letter bearing the bishop's personal seal and instructing all parties to the matter of the death of Gilles de Maran, Lord of Valmire, to suspend proceedings pending a formal ecclesiastical inquiry into the circumstances of his death. The second man was older, travel-worn, with the bearing of someone who has ridden hard and recently and is not finished being angry about it. He was Elspeth's father, Lord Henri de Caussade, whose castle was crumbling and whose name still carried weight, had ridden through the night on a horse that was too old for the journey after receiving a message that his daughter's sworn protector had sent simultaneously with the letter to the bishop. Via a second rider, Aldous' men had not thought to watch for because they had been watching the first one. Aldrich had sent two riders. He had told no one. He had not even told Elspeth because telling her would have given her hope that he was not yet certain he could deliver, and a hope that fails is sometimes worse than no hope at all. The hall understood, in the way that rooms full of people understand things before anyone has spoken, that something had changed. The configuration of what was present, the bishop's clerk, the father, the knight at the back wall who had clearly not been sent to the eastern marches, was not the configuration of a hearing that was going to proceed as planned. Count Aldous saw all of this from the dais. His face did not change. This was, Aldrich would later think, the most genuinely impressive thing he had ever witnessed the man do. Aldous stood. He welcomed the assembled household with the warmth of a man presiding over a necessary formality. He acknowledged, with gracious smoothness, the presence of the bishop's representative, and indicated that the ecclesiastical concerns would of course be given every proper consideration in due course, and that the present matter was a straightforward question of a state administration that need not wait upon a separate inquiry. He was, in his delivery, magnificent, the performance of a man who has prepared for every contingency and is simply integrating new information into a plan that remains, fundamentally, intact. Then Aldrich walked forward from the back of the hall. He walked the full length of it in silence, and the silence was complete, the held-breath silence of people who understand that what they are watching is the kind of moment that gets remembered. He stopped at the center of the open floor, equidistant between the dais and the door, and he turned to face the count. "My lord," he said, addressing Aldous with the formal courtesy that the situation required and that cost him visibly nothing. "I appear before this court as sworn protector of Lady Elspeth de Maran, under an oath taken before God and the assembled household of this estate in the presence of the late Raymond de Maran, Lord of Valmire." He paused. "That oath has not been revoked. It has not lapsed. It endures, in the law of this land and in the sight of God, until I release it or until I die. I have not released it." Aldous looked at him from the dais with the expression of a man watching a fire he believed he had put out the day before. "Sir Aldrich, your dedication to your commission is noted. However, the question before this court..." "The question before this court," Aldrich said, with a quietness that was louder than most men's shouting, "is whether Lady Elspeth de Maran is guilty of the death of her husband. I am here to tell this court that she is not. I am here to tell this court what she is guilty of being competent in a household that needed her competence and resented her for it, of knowing things that powerful men preferred she did not know, of surviving, with intelligence and without complaint, in a position that was designed to make her invisible and became dangerous the moment she refused to be." The hall was absolutely still. "I am also here," he continued, "to present to the bishop's representative and to Lord Henri de Caussade and to every man and woman in this hall, certain documents pertaining to the management of the Valmir road revenues, and certain testimony pertaining to the events of the night of the Lord Gilas's death, which I believe this court will find materially relevant to the question of who, in this matter, bears actual responsibility. He reached into the satchel at his side, the same satchel Barreau had packed for him 2 nights ago, in a conversation that had lasted until nearly dawn, and placed the documents on the floor of the hall, and the bishop's clerk came forward and received them, and Lord Henri de Caussade stood at the back of the hall with his hands clasped and his jaw set, and his eyes very bright. Aldous de Valmire said nothing. For the first time in this story, he said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not make what was already happening worse. It was Elspeth who spoke next. She had been standing since she entered the room. No chair had been offered to her, which was itself a statement about the kind of court this was intended to be. She stood now in the center of the hall, in the cold morning light. And when she spoke, it was not to the count or to the clerks or to her father or to the bishop's man. She spoke to the household, to Béraud and to Perrin, and to the servants along the walls who had watched her manage and organize and remember and work for 2 years, quietly, without credit or title or recognition. "I have nothing to confess," she said simply, "except that I loved this house. And I am sorry that love was not enough to protect it from the people who loved only what it was worth." The silence after that lasted a long time. Perrin, the guard captain, stepped forward from his place along the wall. He crossed the floor and stood beside Aldrich, which was not a legal gesture but was, in every other sense, complete. Béraud did not cross the floor. He was not a brave man, but he looked at the count's clerks and he said in a voice that shook only slightly, that he wished the record to show that the steward of Valmir was available to give testimony regarding the estate accounts at the court's convenience. It was not a revolution. It was not a battle. It was smaller and quieter and in its way more devastating than either. It was a room full of people who had been waiting to see which way the wind was blowing, finally deciding that they would rather face the consequences of being right than the consequences of being complicit. Count Aldous de Valmire descended from the dais. He did it with dignity. Aldrich gave him that. He spoke briefly with his 2 men-at-arms, and then he addressed the room in the measured tone of a man recalibrating in real time, indicating that in light of the ecclesiastical interest in the matter, he was naturally prepared to defer to the appropriate authorities, and that his only concern had always been the orderly governance of the estate, and that he was confident the inquiry would confirm the propriety of his intentions. He left the hall with his men before the morning bell rang twice. Elspeth stood in the middle of the floor and watched him go. Her face was composed and her hands were still, and she looked to the room, like a woman who had won. Aldrich, standing 6 feet from her, was close enough to see that her hands were shaking. He did not reach for them. The hall was full of people. The situation required still the correct distance. But he looked at her, and she looked at him, and between them passed the full weight of everything that had been not named, and everything it had cost, and everything it had preserved, and everything it could not now become. Not here, not in this hall, not in a world where an oath of protection and a knight's honor and a widow's reputation were not merely personal matters, but legal and social structures with walls and ceilings, and no doors that opened in the direction either of them needed. Her father reached her before Aldrich could speak. Lord Henri embraced his daughter with the fierce, slightly desperate relief of a man who has spent a night's hard riding constructing the speech he would give at her trial, and has arrived to find, against all reason, that the speech is not needed. Aldrich stepped back. He gave them the space. He would have walked away entirely, found some corner of the estate where he could be professionally occupied and personally invisible, but she looked up from her father's shoulder and found him with her eyes before he could move. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say in that hall, in that moment, in that world, that would not have cost them both something they had already paid too much to lose. But she looked at him. She looked at him in the way that people look at each other when language has reached its limit, and the only honest thing left is simply to be seen. He held that look for 3 full seconds. Then he nodded, once, and turned, and walked out of the hall, into the cold November morning. His oath was fulfilled. His post at Valmere was, in any practical sense, concluded. The bishop's inquiry would take months. Lord Henri would stay to see his daughter through it. Béraud and Perrin would manage the estate. He had no reason to remain. He had every reason in the world to remain. These two facts walked beside him across the courtyard, one on each side, in the cold morning light that showed every stone and every shadow with equal and indifferent clarity.